Good evening, fellow citizens. How are you all this morning, this afternoon? It's wonderful to see so many crowded in the streets. They're sitting out in the foyer. This reminds me of the 19th century when everyone was fired up and engaged in their civic responsibility, concerned about the state of the nation. And so I'm feeling quite at home today in this 21st century, in this modern era. And I'm very happy to see so many young people in the audience as well. It is really exhilarating. I'm just taking a moment to just catch my breath, as a matter of fact. I was speaking this morning over in Portsmouth, Virginia. I remember I visited that city back around 1867, and I spoke on the courthouse steps of Portsmouth, and I gave a speech there. And I certainly came through Yorktown. I can't remember if I gave any particular speeches in this city, but when and where might not be the case. So important as to the why that I was doing what I was doing. The movement of the abolitionists, eradicating slavery and fighting for suffrage, universal suffrage in America. And so you know me now as Frederick Douglass. I was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey on the Eastern Shore in Talbot County near St. Michael's. Has anyone ever visited the Eastern Shore? Yes, and so if you have visited the Eastern Shore, if you have crossed a ferry across the Chesapeake Bay and then traveled that long road that dissects the community, then you have seen the farms where we worked as slaves, where I was born in Talbot County along the Tuckahoe River. We have some seats here, young people, if you'd like to sit. No? You're going to stand. Well, that's wonderful. And so, yes. Well, you see me carrying a cane, and that's not because I'm so feeble. Although I'm 201 years old, I just had a birthday on Thursday. I was in Alexandria. I celebrated my birthday, and some young children made me some wonderful cards and sung happy birthday to me. And so I do look quite well for 201, don't I? I'm still known as the Lion of Anacostia. I am sometimes referred to as an orator, but for the life of me, I cannot tell why that reputation is accorded me. I just have a simple story of a Maryland colored boy who escaped from slavery. I was born around the year 1818. I do not know the date of my birth, the exact date of my birth, as slaves did not know the dates of their birth. The closest they could come would be planting time, harvest time, cherry time. A slave with any such knowledge as their birthday or how to read or write would be an educated slave, and the saying in the realms of slavery and bondage was an educated slave would be a worthless slave. And so they kept all that knowledge from us. I was taken away from my mother before I even finished nursing, as was that custom as well. Mothers were sold off to another plantation to continue their work. I was given to an older mistress on the plantation. In that case, it was my grandmother. I was given to her to be raised until I was old enough to work in the field. My mother was sold to the Hicks plantation, 12 miles away. I never saw her during the light of day. She would occasionally walk 24 miles round trip just to rock me to sleep at night. By the time I woke the next morning, she would be gone back to the plantation to answer the bell to work in the field. And of course, there was two ways to answer that bell, either by hearing or by feeling. And if you did not wake by the hearing of the bell, you would feel the bell with the lash and get up and work. So she would scurry back to that plantation, and I woke the next morning looking around for her, and I could not find her. My mother passed away. She became sick around the age of, when I was 6 years old. She was dead in the ground. They buried her without even letting me know. And so I spent that time on the plantation. My task as a young boy was to keep the yard clean, to sweep up the leaves, to make sure the cows and horses that got out of the gate, I would shoo them back in or go fetch them. It was a brutal situation. Slavery was a criminal institution that not only meant a treacherous situation for the Negro, but debilitating for the white man as well. And I will certainly give you an example of this. Now, in this plantation, and I'm going to read to you just what the rations might have been. And children in the audience, I certainly want you to listen carefully, because this would have been a description of the rations given to you on a plantation. The adults would receive your rations and safeguard them for the month and the year. The yearly rations of clothes and the monthly allowance of food, and I'm reading here from my narrative. I wrote 3 books in my lifetime, 3 autobiographies: Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, My Bondage and My Freedom, and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. I also tried my hand at a little historical fiction. I actually wrote a novella. But of course, what I'm giving you here today is certainly absolute truth and not an exaggeration whatsoever about my personal experience in slavery. Now, this from Narrative of the Life. Here too, the slaves of all the farms received as their monthly allowance of food 8 pounds of pork or its equivalent of fish. And I did say or, not and. If you received fish, you did not receive pork. If you received pork, you did not receive fish. And that meat was quite often rancid, and you would have to cook it well just to prevent from having a sour stomach. 1 bushel of cornmeal for the month. Regardless of how many children you had, you could have 5 children, and 1 bushel of cornmeal will be what you got. The children, too young to work in the fields, and most of you look like you're already past that age. Do we have any young children here, 6, 7 years old? No? Well, the children too young in the fields received neither, well, let me get back now. The adults received as their yearly clothing allowance 2 coarse linen shirts, 1 pair of linen shirts like the trousers, 1 pair of stockings, 1 jacket, the whole of which could have cost no more than $7. The children too young to work in the fields received neither jackets, nor trousers, nor stockings. They received 2 linen shirts per year. And when those failed them, they went naked for the rest of the year, regardless of the weather. And you see, as a young boy, I walked around on that plantation with just a linen shirt, barefoot. I slept on the cold, hard ground with a burlap bag over my head. My feet were out, and I frequently had frostbite on cold winter nights with cracks big enough to put a pencil in the cracks in my feet. It was a brutal situation. I was often very hungry, and I would go to the window of Miss Lucretia Hall and sing a song or two. I got my knack for singing that way. Follow, 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 follow the drinking gourd. Well, the old man is waiting to follow you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. Now, that wouldn't have been a song I would have sung to Miss Lucretia. That was a secret song for us slaves. But nevertheless, she heard me singing, and she would maybe pass a biscuit out the window, curb my hunger. And this horse, I had a favorite horse. He and I bonded a friendship that he would run away quite frequently to the next farm, to the Y plantation. And when I went to fetch him, Master Anthony said, "Go get that horse." And I would run to the next farm and get that horse. And when I got there, he would be eating hay, fat and happy. Seems like there was more hay on the Y plantation. And when I got there to retrieve the horse, one of the overseers at the Y plantation would hand me a biscuit as well. And so I devised a plan that I would occasionally let that horse run. Any way to feed ourselves. Anything, including stealing if we had to, if we were hungry. We would trade with the masterless men. There were other white masterless men who were just as impoverished as slaves. They were not in bondage, but they were very impoverished. And so I'm there on that plantation, really experiencing and witnessing some of the most brutal situations I've ever seen you would not even be able to fathom. I will give you this one incident where one of my aunts had found a kinship or a friendship with a slave next door, and they would meet occasionally. And Captain Anthony told my Aunt Harriet, not to go over there and see that boy. Well, they were drawn to each other, and so they snuck out at night and met in the cornfield, and that next morning, Captain Anthony found out about it. He brought my aunt in, and I was cowering away in the cupboard, and I heard him, and he put her on a stool in the middle of the kitchen, up on her toes, and tied her hands to a rafter in the middle of the kitchen, and began to whip her mercilessly, cursing her with every blow. Now, why did he do that? Certainly, that slave boy did not want to harm her at all. They were friends. But he had his own design for my Aunt Harriet. And so he wanted to make sure that nobody got their pickings before he did. And so that was the situation. Those are some of the things that I experienced as a slave. But then a great providence came to me that Miss Lucretia All called me one day. She said, "Freddie, come here." I ran to the great house, and when I got there, she said, "We're going to send you to Baltimore to live with our cousins, Mr. Hugh and Sophia Auld." And when I got there, she said, "Now go down to the creek and wash yourself up. The people in Baltimore are well kept. We don't want them laughing at you, so go down there and wash yourself up. Get all that mange off your feet and ankles, and we're going to give you your first pair of breeches." Now, can you imagine? Sir, you're standing there. You have a nice coat on, a nice pair of dungarees. Just let me know this now. How many pair of pants have you been given this year alone? Yes, either of you. 6 pair of pants this year. Goodness. Well, can you imagine not getting a pair of pants, your first pair of pants, until you were 8 years old? And so when I was told I was giving my first pair of pants, I didn't know which to be more excited about, leaving the plantation or getting my first pair of pants. But I went down to that creek, and I stayed down there for hours. I was washing my feet and my legs and washing up, and I went back to the great house, and Miss Lucretia gave me my nice pair of pants. They put me on a ship, and I sailed for Baltimore. Well, when we arrived in Baltimore, and I got there and helped finish unloading the sheep and the cargo of the ship, they took me down to Fells Point, to the home of Mr. Hugh and Miss Sophia Auld. When I knocked on the door, to my surprise, was a white woman, smiling, beaming at me, saying, "Freddie, come on in. We've been waiting for you. Are you hungry? Are you tired? It's been a long trip. We've got a bed prepared for you. Come on in and get some rest." Well, I was certainly quite surprised. I was shocked even. A white woman smiling at me this way? Even on the plantation, you were not even allowed to look in the face of your master. And so this woman with a kind spirit, with a generous heart, set me aback. But of course, as I said, the Aulds in Baltimore had never owned slaves before. And so I made my way in. My task with the Aulds, and I was to live with them for quite some time, was to be the helpmate for their young son, Master Thomas. He was around my age. And so my chores were to make sure that he, in the morning, got up and I would fix his bed. After he finishes eating, I would wash his plate out, walk him to school and back and forth. And then in the afternoon, after he finishes his supper, wash his plate, prepare him for bed, tuck him in. Those are my tasks in Baltimore. And to my surprise, Mrs. Auld was a great reader. She loved to sit in her rocking chair and read the newspaper or the Bible. And as I sat down beside her in the rocking chair, she would often offer a passage from the Bible, a verse or two, help me with pronunciations of words and such, teach me an A, B, or C. Now, when I got words to describe my misery as a slave, those words ignited a fire in my brain. You know, once your brain is free, once your mind is free, your body has to follow. You cannot enslave a freed mind. And so I wanted every word I could find. I used every effort I could, every ingenious method to find every word, every letter that I could to improve my vocabulary. And so I would take biscuits from the cupboard in the morning as we walked boys and girls back to school and such. I would offer a biscuit to a young man. I would say, young sir, if you are still hungry from this morning's breakfast, I have a biscuit, would be food for your stomach. If you have a word from your notebook, it would be food for my brain. And we would make the trade, and then I would be much well fed. Even as we were walking along, I would say to the young masters, well, young master, I can make an A. I can make a C. And they would be so surprised, so startled, like, no, there's no way that you, a slave, can write. Who taught you to write? And I said, I will prove it to you. Oh, well, there's a young lady back here on the row, back there. Young lady, would you like to come up? Come up on stage with me. Yes, right here, with the plaid shirt. Join me on stage, please. Yes. Yes, that young lady. Let's give her some encouragement, people. Come on up here. Yes, yes, ma'am. And what is your name, ma'am? Excuse me? Ariel. And how old are you, Ariel? 12 years old. And so we would be walking along back and forth to school, you see, and I would say to the young master, well, I can make an A or I can make a C, and they would be, no way you can make an A or a C. And I was like, well, I will show you that I can make a C, but you will have to show me how to make a W. And so we would kneel down on the ground, come here, and I would make out the C. All right, now show me the W. Oh, my goodness, I've just learned a new letter. Quite ingenious, don't you think? Yes, and so that's the way I taught myself some of my A, B's, and C's. Now, go back and sit down now. I'm going to call on you later, all right? And so I'm spending my time there learning how to read and write as much as I can. And then Mr. Hugh went to Miss Sophia, and he said to her, Miss Sophia, understanding you're teaching Freddie how to read, do not teach that nigger how to read. You give a nigger an inch, he'll take an L. Do not teach him how to read. You know that is against the rules. Do not do that in this household. And so, there you have it. What slavery does to people who have never owned slaves before, who previously had a kind spirit, a generous face, a smile, eyes shining, started to fade. She obeyed her husband, and not only obeyed him, but wanted to go even further to please him. And so she became very strict on not sharing a single letter with Frederick Douglass. As a matter of fact, even if I was in my room just trying to read a note or two, she would rush right in and say, Freddie, what are you doing? Surely you're not reading. If I had a book or anything, she would snatch it from me. And so this is what slavery did to her. But, of course, all this reading, as I said, made me a worthless slave. I became quite unruly, restless even, that I had words to describe my misery as a slave. And so I was there in Fells Point, and then there became a disagreement between Master Thomas and Master Hugh, the brothers, and out of that disagreement, they said I would have to come back to Talbot County. And so when I came back to Talbot County, Master Thomas put me in the servitude of a notorious slave breaker by the name of Mr. Edward Convey. Now, this man had a reputation for breaking even the most unruly slaves. And I was to stay with him for at least a year, and he was to break my spirit. And I will tell you this for a fact, that he almost was very successful at breaking my spirit. I remember sitting on the banks of the eastern shore, only a few rods from the house. looking at the ships sail down the Chesapeake Bay, and I was so depressed. My spirit had been so broken that I was ready to either kill myself or kill Mr. Convey. Either way, I would not be standing here today. But how did I find the hope to keep me moving? Well, those sails, those ships, those white sails billowing in the wind represented freedom. I saw freedom there, and if I could at least be on the deck of one of those ships, I might find my way out of this career as a slave. And so I decided right there I would live, and I decided I would not get another whipping. Mr. Convey was giving me the lash almost every day. And so, as a matter of fact, one of the other slaves on that plantation came to me. He said, now I have this root, and if you put this root in your pocket, it will prevent you from receiving the lash. Now, I didn't think too much of this root thing, but he was so impressive about his story about not getting a lash. He carried a root around in his pocket that I thought I would try it, anything, not to feel that lash, that cowhide. And so I put the root in my pocket, and I went for several days, and I didn't get a lash. I said, well, there might be something to this root. Until I made a fatal mistake that I broke his cart. And I think this was on a Saturday. I had been sent to fetch some wood, and I broke the cart on the way back. And then that Sunday, no whipping, and I said, well, there really must be something to this root. Ordinarily, I would have got at least 40 lashes for breaking his cart. Well, on that Monday, he sent me into the barn to throw down some hay, and I'm in the loft throwing down the hay. And he walks in, and I see he's holding the cowhide. And he says, Freddie, come down here. He grabbed a rope and tried to tie me. And at that moment, a spark lit inside me. I grabbed him around the neck, and I fought him for at least 2 hours. He called an overseer. The overseer came in and was trying to help corral me, and I kicked him in the stomach, and he went out. He called one of the other slaves. The slave came in. He said, help me get Freddie here. The slave told him, you brought me here to work, not to beat other slaves. And he left out. Left me and Mr. Convey just struggling on the ground, and I was on top of him, holding him down, holding him fiercely, my nails drawing blood out of his skin. And then finally, I thought that probably he got the worst of it, and I stood up, and he stood up, and he brushed himself off, and he looked at me, and he said, now, that will teach you, Freddie, not to do that again. Well, he was the one that got the worst of that whipping. I was the winner. He could have certainly taken me down to Talbot County, to St. Michael's, and put me on the whipping post and given me 100 lashes. But why didn't he do that? Well, his reputation was at stake. If you're known as the notorious slave breaker and they're sending you slaves, paying you to keep slaves and break them, well, if you have to send a slave down to the whipping post, you might be getting ready to lose your reputation and your job. And so from that point on, I fairly did not receive a lash ever again. And when I did, I fought back. It was always a fight after that. I would either be fighting or die. And so I started devising a plan to escape. I made a pact with 4 other slaves, and we tried to escape. One of them turned out to be a traitor, and we ended up locked up in prison 3 months before they bailed me out. And when Captain Anthony came to bail me out, he told me, he said, now, Freddie, you're the last one we're bonding out. And I've been offered a great sum of money for you. I could have easily sold you down to Mississippi or Alabama. But I have a great friendship for you, a fond kinship. So I'm going to send you back to Baltimore with my brother, Mr. Hugh. And so they sent me back to Baltimore. Now, when I arrived back in Baltimore, I'm around 16 years old, and he put me working in the shipyards in Fells Point. I was a ship's fitter, ship's caulker, fitting the tar and cloth between the timbers of ships. And I learned that trade quite well. And I was making money. Well, my master was making money. I was making around $6 a week. And I had to take all that back to my master and give it all to him, and he would give me back 6 cents. Yes, can you imagine? Hard labor, making $6, and then you have to give it all away except for 6 cents. Still slavery. And I would make that trade with him, and he would look at me, and I would be thinking to myself, you're a common thief, stealing a man's money. And so I decided to make a plan where I would escape. I was actually had some free time, and I would go out to this little organization they had in Baltimore. It was called the Mental Improvement Association, where young people got together and they learned various things and civic responsibility and such, black people, Negroes. And so I met this one young lady named Anna Mary, and she happened to be a free woman. And so we made a pact that we would escape, I would escape, and she would help me escape. And the plan was to dress up like a sailor and make my way to New York, where she would meet me, and then we would be in free territory. And so, rather than the rudimentary way of following how normally slaves would escape, I decided to dress up like a sailor. Now, one thing I forgot to mention here, and this is important because by this time I had become quite a good reader and writer. And I had been shining shoes in Fells Point, Baltimore, and I purchased this book. Now, this book is called The Columbian Orator. We have many school children. Have you ever seen this book, children? You have this book in your class, The Columbian Orator? Well, it was actually a men's version, a boys' version, and a girls' version for girls' schools. And this book is full of great speeches of orators, poems, poets, and such. And children would have to memorize and recite these in class. And so I purchased this book for 75 cents. And as a matter of fact, in this book, there are the very first poem I ever learned how to recite. So if I could get the young lady who was here before, if you could come up and help me read, and maybe 2 other volunteers, if I could get a volunteer to come up and read with Frederick Douglass, please. We have 1. Could we have 2 more? Now, don't be shy, young people. You do this in school all the time, do you not? Yes, come on up. Yes. We have the young people here. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to read together the first poem that yours truly ever recited out loud. Now, the poem is here in the parentheses. I'll let you hold my book if you promise to give it back now. This is more than 200 years old, and the poem is right here. Let's see. Yes, I think that's it right there. And this is for you. Now, we're going to read this in unison, call and response format. I will repeat I would say the line, and then you repeat after me. How about that? All right, are you ready to read? Wonderful. And now speak loudly and clearly for the audience. This is how I taught myself to become an orator. Are you ready to listen, audience? Yes. Wonderful. Well, let us read. You'd scarce expect one of my age.
You'd scarce expect one of my age.
Is that, did I turn to the right page? Yes. Okay. I didn't hear you speaking. All right, let's start again. You'd scarce expect one of my age.
You'd scarce expect one of my age.
To speak in public on the stage.
To speak in public on the stage.
And if I chance to fall below.
And if I chance to fall below.
Demosthenes or Cicero.
Demosthenes or Cicero.
Well, they pronounce those right well, don't you think? Their pronunciation is there. Now, do you know who those people are? No? Yeah. Well, there would be a lesson there that if you're reading, young people, and you come to a word that you don't know, a person, you don't want to gloss over it. You don't want to pass it by, just skim over it. You want to stop there, ask your parents or your teacher, who is this person, what did they do, what did they accomplish in life, and then once you know the answer, then move forward. You certainly don't want to fail the test at the end of the day, do you not? All right. So let us keep reading. Don't view me with a critic's eye,
Don't view me with a critic's eye,
but pass my imperfections by.
but pass my imperfections by.
Large streams from little fountains flow.
Large streams from little fountains flow.
Tall oaks from little acorns grow.
Tall oaks from little acorns grow.
And though I now am small and young,
And though I now am small and young,
of judgment weak and feeble tongue,
of judgment weak and feeble tongue,
yet all great learned women like me
yet all great learned women like me
once learned to read their ABC.
once learned to read their ABC.
Wonderful. Let's give them a round of applause. Yes. Now, you did see that the word woman was not in the text.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I was a man who fought for women's suffrage, and so we just did a little ad-libbing, so to speak. Now, I have a present for all of you for participating. This is a very important document. It's not money, but it is worth money. This is a copy of the U.S. Constitution.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. And so we'll get to why I chose the Constitution as a gift in a little while. Now, I escaped from slavery. I dressed up like a sailor. I used not the normal method, which was at that time to use the papers, use the freedom papers of another slave. Now, in that case, if this man was free, he would mail me his papers, and then I would use his papers on my escape route, and if I were stopped, I would show those papers to prove that I was free. Now, the problem therein would be that if I am a handsome man, as I am, and I use this man's papers, they would say, that's not you. You don't, this describes a man that is not quite so handsome, so. So I thought that that might not be a good method of trying to escape. So I used the method, proven true at this point, of using the sailor's papers, which did not have a description. It only had the name of the sailor and an eagle. And so when I ran away, I got that ticket and I got on the train. And I remember sitting on the train there, and the conductor came through, and he was checking the papers of all the people, the Negroes, and he was treating them quite severely. He would look at their papers and look at them, and look around, and then check the other man's papers and such. And when he got to me, he said, "Where are your papers?" I said, "Well, sir, I do not carry my papers out to sea. All I have is my sailor papers." And I flashed my paper, and he saw that eagle, and he said, well, carry on. Well, I was not free just yet. I remember on that train in Wilmington, and I'm sitting in the seat by the window, and I'm looking north. And there's a train that comes up and stops, headed south. And when I look out the window, there is a master from the plantation in Talbot County. I looked the other way, and luckily he was not looking my way. And then the train proceeded, and I proceeded on. A close call. And so, luckily, I ended up in New York. I sent for my wife, or my soon-to-be wife, Anna Murray, and then we made our way to Massachusetts. And so when we arrived there, of course, I had changed my name to Frederick, from Frederick Bailey to Frederick Johnson. I was a runaway. And we were living with Mr. Nathan and Polly Johnson. And it seems like every slave that ran away in Boston named himself Johnson. I told Mr. Johnson there are so many Johnsons here, I might get lost in the fray. I certainly don't want to be captured with the name Bailey, but I certainly would like another name. And so he was reading a poem at the time, a poem called Lady on the Lake. And in that poem, the main character's name was Douglas. And so he said, "Well, how does this sound, Frederick Douglass?" I said, "This sounds quite fitting." And so I adopted the name, and you know me today as Frederick Douglass. And so we were married, and we moved our family to Lynn, Massachusetts, and we started a family. I ended up having 5 children, Edward, Louis, Frederick Jr., Rosetta, and Annie. Those are my 5 children. I met the Mr. William Lloyd Garrison, the Garrisonians. I started reading the Liberator newspaper and finding out what abolition was all about. And upon attending some of those meetings and finding out my story, the Garrisonians wanted me to stand up and give my story. And with shaking knees, I told my story for the first time. The crowd was very excited about hearing my story. I was very nervous. And then the Garrisonians actually said, we're going to send you on a tour. We're going to pay you to speak all over the North about your story. You will certainly motivate some people to join the abolitionist movement. And so I did. I started speaking, and shortly thereafter, people started to criticize. They said, now, you say this Negro can read, and he can write, and he speaks so eloquently. Surely he's not a slave. He can orate in this manner. They said, he's been to some school, and you're pawnting him off as a slave. And I went back to Mr. Garrison. I said, what should I do? And he said, well, heretofore you have been hiding the names and places and the incidents of brutality. You need to start naming places. You need to start naming your masters and your overseers. Well, this created a problem. Well, I wrote out a manuscript. It was the first manuscript for Narrative of the Life. When I showed that manuscript to Mr. Garrison looked at it and he handed it back to me. He said, if I were you, I would put that in the fire. Yes. And so what they decided to do was to send me out of the country for a short time just so that things would calm down and people would stop looking for me. So they put me on a ship sailing for England, and I landed in Liverpool. Was only supposed to spend 4 days in Liverpool in Ireland and ended up spending 4 months. The people there, of course, slavery was not an institution in Ireland or England, and so I was treated not as chattel property, but as a free man. I was treated as an equal. And so I spoke all the way from the Giant's Causeway to Cape Fear. In Limerick, Belfast, all of those cities, I spoke fiercely for the abolition and for temperance. And then eventually, after about 21 months, it was time to make my decision on whether to go back. They had actually raised quite a sum of money to keep me there. They said, stay here, Freddie. Well, I'll go back to America where there is still slavery. Stay here with us. We'll buy you a house and land. We'll pay for your family to come over. You don't have to go back to that pit over there. But I started thinking about my brothers and sisters on the plantation. My mother was buried there. My fellow men and women in bondage. And I felt like I had to go back. And so I told them, I said, well, I'm going back. Can you use that money to purchase my freedom? And so how much do you think they purchased my freedom for? Anyone care to wager? 500? We have 500 here. Can we get 600? Well, you laugh, but that was basically the way humans were sold at the auction. $733.16. Purchased my freedom. And Julius Griffiths raised another $2,500 to start my newspaper, the North Star. And so when I got back, I purchased a press, and we shipped that to Rochester. I moved my family from Lynn to Rochester, and I started my newspaper, the North Star. And we started printing stories. It was quite a great newspaper. As a matter of fact, someone handed me, this is the black press here in the 20th century, or 21st century we are now in, I believe. And this is your black press. Is anyone aware of this newspaper? Yes. The New Journaling Guide. And so this would have been equivalent to my time of the North Star newspaper and other black newspapers that gave stories. And I'm reading, I'm reading the headlines. What are you people doing in Virginia? Well, we'll get to that. And so I printed that newspaper, and I met with the women's suffrage movement. Up there was Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth. Harriet Tubman was bringing slaves all the way up to Rochester. She would frequently stop at my house with a slave or two, a runaway, that is, and we would give them refuge, feed them, let them rest on their way to Canada. And I stayed in Rochester for many years. Even during the antebellum and the Civil War, I was traveling back and forth, lobbying with Abraham Lincoln, demanding that he add Negroes to the fight of colored troops. Start colored troops not just fetching water and supplies, but give them a U.S. chevron on their shoulder, an eagle on their cap, and a U.S. rifle. And if the Constitution defends us, we will defend the Constitution. There are examples of this. We're commemorating now, are we not, 400 years of the first Africans landing right here nearby at Port Comfort. They came in, I believe it was 19 Africans on the White Lion, landed at Port Comfort. It just so happens that the same place they landed is the same place that slavery ended, at Fort Monroe. And so this is a commemoration that you should all be aware of. The fact that after that 1619, that blacks took part in the founding of this country in the Revolutionary War. Crispus Attucks, the Black Minuteman of Massachusetts, Mombet, all these people gave their lives for the founding of the Union. And so now that the Union is in jeopardy, why would we not be a part of that fight as well? This is the argument that I made to Abraham Lincoln. And eventually, through prudence, at least, they saw that the numbers alone would mean a victory. And so they started adding colored troops. Now, after that, and the Emancipation Proclamation, which gave us a great victory, many said the abolition would be over and that we could give up the fight. I said, nonsense. We still don't have citizenship. We cannot vote. Women cannot vote. We still have much to be fighting for. And so we continued to fight. We continued to agitate. And in all of that, I moved my family from Rochester to Washington, D.C. My sons, who had taken part in the Civil War, Lewis and Charles, were decorated men. You know, they were part of the 54th Regiment. They fought at Fort Sumter. One became a first sergeant, the other a sergeant major. So I was quite proud of them. And when we moved down to Washington, D.C., they became records keepers. I became the U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia. I eventually became the ambassador to the country of Haiti. I was even nominated as a vice presidential candidate. Yes, alongside a woman, the first woman to run for president. There's a student here, can tell me who the first woman to run for president? Any student? Do you know? Ladies? No? The first woman out in the hallway. We have interested people. Did someone back there say Hillary Clinton, I believe? No, I have no idea who this woman is. It was Victoria Woodhull, the first woman, nominated by the state of Kentucky. And I said, I will not run with Victoria Woodhull. They said, Mr. Douglas, I thought you were for suffrage. I said, well, I am for suffrage, but I'm not a politician. I'm not going to come to York to these great men and women who started this council and say one thing and then go to Williamsburg and say something else. I'm not a politician. And so I turned that opportunity down. So I did accomplish many things in my lifetime. I was quite proud of partnering with the suffrage movement to do that. And so, and I gave many speeches in my lifetime. Some of the speeches I gave, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, the Haiti speech, the woman suffrage speech, the Dred Scott speech. What would you like to hear today? Any particular word or message? No? Hope? Did I hear that word? You wanted a word of hope, yes. Well, I would say to you, probably one of the most hopeful times, because I'm thinking about the Dred Scott speech. That was a very fierce speech because I was extremely upset about the decision handed down by that Supreme Court justice. I was really telling them a piece of my mind on the 4th of July. But I think one of the most optimistic times was when they asked me to sign the Declaration of Sentiments for the women, and they asked me to be the master of ceremony at that occasion, at their conference. And so I was one of 33 men who signed the Declaration of Sentiments. Many men came to the conference, but not to support the women, but to ridicule them for having the audacity to stand up and speak for their rights. Do you know, young lady standing there, you're a black woman, but even the white women at that time could not own land, could not vote. Even if this woman's husband passed away, she could not inherit his land. They were considered too dainty, should not be bothered with such problemsome issues as owning land and property and such, and so that land would be willed to his brother or whoever, one of his sons. And so I took great pride in standing before the women of that conference and telling them in so many words this. Mrs. President, ladies and gentlemen, I come to this platform with unusual diffidence. Although I have been long identified with the woman suffrage movement and have often spoken in its favor, I am at somewhat of a loss to know what to say on this really great and uncommon occasion where so much has been said. When I look around on this assembly and I see the many able and eloquent women full of subject and ready to speak, I would not now speak, but for my early connection with the cause and having been called to do so by this council. Men have very little business here as speakers, and if they come here at all, they should take the back benches and wrap themselves in silence. For this is an international council, not for men, but for women, and woman should have all there is to say in it. This is her day in court. I've heard many men speak on this subject, some of them the most eloquent to be found anywhere in the country. But I believe no man, however gifted in thought and speech, can voice the wrongs and present the demands of woman with the skill and effect, with the power and authority of woman herself. He can neither speak for her, nor vote for her, nor act for her, nor be responsible for her. And the thing for men to do in the premises is just to get out of the way and give her the opportunity to exercise all the powers inherent in her individual personality. Her right to be and to do is as full, complete, and perfect as the right of any man on earth. I say to her, as I say to the colored people, give her fair play and hands off. There may be some well-meaning people in this audience who have never attended a woman suffrage conference, never read a woman suffrage newspaper, never heard a woman suffrage speech, and they may be surprised that those who speak here do not argue the question. The demand of the hour is not argument, but assertion. Firm and inflexible assertion which has more power than the force of an argument. If there is any argument to be made, it should be made by the opponents, not by the friends of the woman suffrage. They will find not one reason, not one consideration that can be urged supporting the right of men to vote that does not equally support the right of women to vote. When I ran away from slavery, it was for myself. When I advocated for emancipation, it was for my people. But when I stood up for the rights of women, self was out of the question, and I found a little nobility in the act. Time itself is a very conservative power. That what is, always was, and always will be, world without end. We have heard this old argument before, ladies, and if you live very long, you shall hear it again. Man has become so accustomed to command and woman to obey that both parties in the relationship have hardened into their respective places and thus has piled up a mountain of iron against woman's franchisement. Such a truth is woman's right to equal liberty with man. She was born with it. It was hers before she comprehended it. And no custom law or usage can ever destroy it. So the women who have thus far caused this agitation have already embodied Theodore Parker's 3 grades of human greatness. First is greatness in executive and administrative ability. Secondly, greatness in ability to organize. And thirdly, in the ability to discover truth. They are seen with the characterizations and the order that preceded this council. They are seen in the steady growth of the movement. And they are heard whenever the mantra of my newspaper is read out loud. Right is of no sex. Truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, ladies. So certainly that should give you some hope. Ladies, do you have the hope? Did you get the right to vote? Yes, yes. Well, I tell you, we were fighting. We continued to fight after the emancipation, and we're fighting for citizenship, fighting for vote when we went to the 15th Amendment. Unfortunately, they said it was not the woman's time, that you had to stand aside. And there came the woman scorned. Amen. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, all those women that I had worked with tirelessly. Well, we parted our ways. Words flew in the newspaper. What privilege they had came out. They said some things that were certainly derogatory, and I was quite angry at what I was reading in the newspapers. We didn't speak for 10 years. Imagine how much time we got lost over the fact that we let them divide and conquer us. 10 years is a whole decade. We could have certainly perhaps even won their right to vote before I passed away in my lifetime. But setbacks like that, we cannot afford to have them. And so that's one lesson for you all here in Virginia, is to continue to work across lines, to exercise your vote and not just use it casually. You know, your civic responsibility starts with this Constitution here. Ladies, what amendment finally gave you the right to vote? Excuse me? 19th Amendment. Wow, wonderful, wonderful. I'm glad someone knows the Constitution. It certainly frightens me when I start asking questions about the modern era audience and they don't know, they can't answer questions about the Constitution. Some people, I believe, I've been to audiences who have basically divested themselves of the Constitution. This was the argument that William Lord Garrison and myself had. He said the Constitution was a flawed document and should be torn up. I said, I'm a Negro who can read. And I see right there in the preamble, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that all men are created equal. That's what it says. I can quote that the same way I can quote the Lord's Prayer. So you can't tell me what it says. Now, there are laws and ordinances built up all around the Constitution that prevent you from your liberties. But if you let someone take control of the Constitution that knows no more about it than you know, then you may be restricted from some of your liberties. And so, at this point, I don't want to take too much time. I know you all have some questions. I'm certainly interested in questions from the young people here. Do we have questions from the audience? Yes, first question right here.
Mr. Douglas, thank you. I'm not sure this is a question, but looking for some information. When
Yes,
you were negotiating your freedom and you were bought your freedom back for $733.16,
Yes.
was that a fair deal. And what I mean by that wasn't the Fugitive Trade Act there, and whoever was sponsoring you, or were you negotiating upon yourself for this? And did anybody hang over your head that, well, the Fugitive Trade Act, I'm going to put whoever's negotiating for you in jail, so I'm going to get a better deal for you? Or how was that deal worked out? Or
Well,
were you
certainly all of that
participating?
came into play, but you remember I was in England at the time, and Miss Julia Griffiths and other people in Britain and in Ireland were raising the money and sending letters back and forth with my masters, Captain Lloyd and Colonel Lloyd and Captain Anthony, for the price. And then once that price was set, then they sent the money, and they got my papers, and I came back. But even still, any man for that matter, not only yours truly, but any man who had his papers certainly still had some consideration to guard himself and his family, because bounty hunters could certainly come and take you, destroy your papers, and send you down to Mississippi or Alabama.
Was that reciprocal? Like the people that were acting for you, could they have been held responsible too for saying, I'm acting on your behalf?
Well, not at that time, no. Now, certainly because, and I was saying before, that if I gave the names of people aiding and abetting slaves from escaping, which was definitely against the law, then those people could be held responsible. But this was an economy. It was an economy. And so the same way you were, it was a little bit lesser than being at the auction block, but still, nevertheless, you were setting a wage, a fair price for property. You might as well have been buying a horse.
I guess my thought was, it seems like you might have been worth much more, but they may have held that over your head. That's what I meant.
Yes. Well, they were waging. Sure. Well, they were waging with Colonel Lloyd, who, of course, knew my value, and most of it was priceless, for that matter. Yes, sir. You had a question, right here.
I think my voice is loud enough, but I was hoping that maybe you could give a short rendition of some time that you spent with Abraham Lincoln.
Yes. As a matter of fact, I spent. There were 3 occasions that I actually visited with Abraham Lincoln. One that I actually turned down. I wish I had not turned that down. It was more in a casual setting that he had sent a letter, a note. And when I stopped by his secretary's office, he passed that note on to me and said the president would like to have tea with you. And I had an engagement that afternoon. I was supposed to be speaking. I had never went back on an engagement. And so I actually turned the president down. But that would have been an opportunity for me to sit with him in a more of a casual nature. Now, the other 2 times that I visited him, the first was, of course, to come back, because I had not met with him prior to him adding black soldiers to the fight. But after that happened, there were several grievances that I had to go to him and plead our case for. Firstly, was that the black man was not getting equal wage as a Union soldier with the white soldiers. And so I was advocating for equal pay. Secondly, that there were no black officers in the ranks, so you could not go beyond an enlisted soldier. And then thirdly and lastly, that there was no such thing as a black prisoner of war. When Negroes were caught in combat, they were immediately executed, hung, lynched, burned. And so we felt like there should be retribution from the Confederates for killing these soldiers, or at least create some sort of treaty where they would be given the opportunity to be prisoners of war and brought back home to their families. And so we had some serious discussions about this, and this is when I first really was in the president's presence and felt that I was dealing with an honest man. Because I immediately felt that I was on equal footing with him. We were looking eye to eye. And his responses were generous and considering I had been following him along, and I hadn't really trusted him that much. Of course, he was a politician. He was debating Stephen A. Douglas in Illinois prior to being elected, you know. When I say Stephen A. Douglas, I'm talking about Douglas with one S, the lesser Douglas. But he was a self-made man just like myself. We had much in common, that he had taught himself how to read over the log fire and such, and I felt that coming from him. The next time I met with him, as a matter of fact, I had went back to his second inauguration, and I'll give you this. Now, this is how you judge a man's character. I was at that second inauguration after he gave his speech, well, just before, as a matter of fact, and there were people all around the White House, as you might imagine, at the inauguration, and Mr. Lincoln and the vice president were standing, and he looked across, and he saw me over, and he gestured to Mr. Johnson that there's my good friend Frederick Douglass. Now, I'm looking right at Abraham Lincoln, and when Johnson looked in my direction, I saw into the window of his soul a scowl that told me there's a no good Negro. And then all of a sudden he realized that I was looking back at him, and he changed his frown to a half smile. And so this is how I judged those two men. Even I can remember a time being with the president, and his secretary came in and said, Mr. President, the governor of Connecticut is here to see you. And he said, not now. I'm with Mr. Douglas. I want more time to talk to Mr. Douglas. And I said, no, sir. I will certainly, I can wait. The governor is one of the most respected governors in the nation. Why would he wait for me? He said, no. We have much to talk about. He can wait. And so this is what Mr. Lincoln did for me. As a matter of fact, I'm carrying around this cane here. And it is not because I'm so feeble. After the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, I was certainly sad and depressed, as most of the country was. I didn't even come out for weeks. But I got a package with a letter. And I opened the package, and it was this cane and a letter from his wife. Can anyone tell, students here, who was Abraham Lincoln's wife? Mary Todd Lincoln, yes, sir. The letter signed Mary Todd Lincoln, saying, in honor of my husband and our greatest president, he left his favorite walking stick for you. He had a great respect. Please keep this as a representation of his fondness and respect for you. And so I walk quite proudly with it. Yes, sir. Do we have another question? Yes, ma'am.
So I teach high school English, and my students have been reading your narrative over the last several weeks.
Yes.
And I don't know that any of my students made it today. I did invite them. But
Yes.
at any rate, they have a question about your birth. And they cannot get their heads around the idea that there's no record anywhere of your actual date of birth. They believe that your masters would have written it down somewhere. And so they're curious as to whether or not there was ever a chance for you to go through those records, or to speak to your master, or perhaps identify who your father was.
Well, certainly it was rumored throughout my life that my father might have been Captain Anthony. As a matter of fact, my second wife, after my first wife passed away, Anna Murray, who gave me 5 children, and I was quite depressed after that. And I spent a couple of months in my bedroom, and then after I pulled out of that, I found myself trying to find happiness, and I found it in Helen Pitts, who was a white woman. Well, you're taking that quite well. but I would not expect any less. And so all this time, of course, I'm still thinking about my origins of when I was born. There was no record of, except for around 1818. Slaves, for that matter, except for the master keeping records, and some masters were more meticulous than others, there might not be any. If you all have tried to trace your heritage, certainly your ability, a Negro's ability to trace his heritage would be much more cumbersome than, say, a white man, because his family lineage has not been broken. His people have not been sold off into captivity. Clear records of birth certificates and marriage certificates and such were documents that were kept, not so much for the black man. And so I certainly spent much time trying to trace and find out who my father was, and eventually I did. I came to the conclusion myself, based on oral tradition and such, that my family was Captain Anthony, and I actually wrote him a letter saying as much, and actually saying that over all the things that he put me through in bondage, I still believed in his spirit as a kind man. And without slavery, it could have been so much different. And so that's where I left it, with the letter that I wrote to my father. Now, when I married Helen Pitts, and people were asking, my family was quite upset about this, and I tried to calm their curiosity. I said, well, my first wife was the color of my mother, and my second wife was the color of my father. Well, that certainly didn't quiet their curiosity, and so I had to explain even further that if you are a Negro and you've been an abolitionist fighting for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that once you think you have won that prize, and I thought I had won that prize of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then when I see happiness in front of me, why would I take half the prize? What white man takes half the prize? He takes all the liberty. And I saw happiness in Helen Pitts. Has not anti-miscegenation been abolished in this country? Yes? And when did that happen? Not sure, but it did happen. Was there some ruling? Oh, Loving versus Virginia. Yes, okay. So if you supported Loving versus Virginia, how can you be against Douglas and Pitts? Yes. Yes, next question.
Last question.
Mr. Douglas, can you speak to the things that were of value to you most in terms of your battle for freedom and equality, and maybe take it a step further into the dangers of our time and what we should be on alert for when people want to try and take things away from us? I think that might be very informational.
Well, I would say this, especially to the young people in the audience. Most of the young people are standing on the wall. I do see some sitting in the audience there. All the young people, say below the age of 21, please stand. Yes. Yes. Now look around you. Look around you. Everyone around you looks old. Okay, go ahead and sit down. You know, that is significant in the fact that when you look back at history, you look at my era, at my age at the time of coming out of slavery at 18 years old, of all the other men and women in your time, and the things they accomplished fighting injustice, social, economic, and political injustice, they were young people just like you. These people here, their days of marching and fighting are pretty much over. The future belongs to you. It's in your hands. You have the intellect. You have the technology to take this country and this world forward. And so it's not too much of a burden on you. You are certainly up for the task. Now, the things that motivated me as a young man were the things that I was denied. First, I was denied my freedom. When you're denied your freedom, you will want to be free. I was denied an education. Imagine if you had to work every day in a field and could not study, could not even say your ABCs. So if you're denied an education, you should want it. And even if you are given it on a platter, you should still want it. And then I'm denied my right to vote, my citizenship. And so I want to vote. And if someone is trying to take that right away from me, I want to fight for that right to vote. Now, you may not have all these things. It may be somewhat subliminal that these things, there may be some people trying to keep you from these things in a moderate way. Certainly, you have books in school, but are they the right books? And even the books you have in school. My good friend, Mark Twain said this, as a matter of fact. He said, don't let your education get in the way of your learning. So there's learning outside of the classroom. Learning is a lifelong process. And so you should seek education, read both sides. Read the black press, read the other press, weed out the fake press, make your own intelligent decision about what is going on, and agitate, agitate, agitate. Thank you. I am yours truly, Frederick Douglass.
Mr. Douglas, thank you very much for an outstanding presentation.
Yeah. 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 Thank you. Thank you so much.